Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
That is always a relief. Yeah.
Yes, we are connected and you can start and open your presentation. Perfect. Thank you.
I know. I'd like to thank you and the Czech presidency and the team and the interpreters as well, and all the technical people in the background for putting this together. I think you are going to show my presentation. I will wait for the team to open it. Yes. I think, can you see the presentation? Okay. So I'd like to move on to the next slide, please, because I always think it's a good idea to mention about the European Union's competence in relation to cultural heritage. So the EU assists and complements the actions of member states in preserving and conserving cultural heritage and develops relevant policies and programs, but also supports these policies through programs such as Creative Europe, the European Capital of Culture, the new European Bauhaus, and Horizon Europe, all these funding programs. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So we have a work plan for culture, and this particular one is 2019 to 2022, and it's coming to an end now. And in this work plan, it called for the setting up of an open method of coordination working group. And this is where the member states nominate experts in the field to the working group, and Czechia, the Czech Republic, was very well represented by the National Heritage Institute, and I'm not sure if Martin Kamansky is in the audience, but if you are, hello Martin, and thank you for all your contribution. Approximately 55 experts met over 18 months and from 28 countries. I've listed them there. You will also see that there are associated countries, Norway, Switzerland and Iceland, and a really good group of people, very enthusiastic and very motivated. And this brings me on to my next slide. The title of this working group, this OMC group, is Strengthening Cultural Heritage Resilience for Climate Change. And this mandate for the group, which is linked to the SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The whole mandate was agreed under the German presidency. And there's a huge growing interest in this particular group and in the report. There was a presentation last year at COP26. Recently, there was a presentation to the Cult Committee of the European Parliament, where I'm based now. And also there's an interest from the United States as well, in particular the National Park Service. And this brings me neatly onto my next slide, please. So the group, what do we do? The objectives were to identify and exchange good practices and innovative measures for the protection of cultural heritage. And this included both the tangible and intangible. And also we looked at the current and emerging threats and impacts of climate change on cultural heritage. And very importantly, we looked at the contribution cultural heritage can make to mitigating and combating climate change in line with the European Green Deal's goals. So what's the purpose of this group? It was to lead to awareness raising, capacity building, and to produce a set of recommendations. And coming on to my next slide. So what we did was, one of the first things we did is we conducted a questionnaire amongst the 28 countries. And one of the things we looked at is what is mentioned about cultural heritage and climate change in national policies. And you'll see there, and I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but one of the things that came through was the responsibility for climate change and the responsibility for culture and cultural heritage rests with different ministries, different government departments. But a very good, outcome was that 15 countries have cultural heritage policies that already mention climate change. So moving on to my next slide. So we produced a report, and the report was published in September, and it's available online. And on the cover of the report, we deliberated, what should we do? And we put an image of the Acropolis in February of last year, which you rarely ever see under snow. And we thought this was quite relevant to the report. And this brings me on to my next slide. So also for part of the report, what it does is it includes 83 case studies from 25 countries. And these case studies are mainly focusing on tangible heritage. There is some intangible, but the focus is on tangible. And also there's a lot of focus. About a third of these case studies are about research projects. So the key points from the case studies is, and what we know, cultural heritage is threatened by climate change. But cultural heritage also offers solutions and inspiration to the climate crisis. We also know that traditional buildings are sustainable and climate friendly. And of course, it's more climate friendly to upgrade and repair than to demolish and rebuild. And also what came out of the report in our meetings was that collaboration of all disciplines is really, really important to get people talking and exchanging. And also continuous monitoring and maintenance is really vital. So my next slide, I just want to very briefly touch on a number of case studies. So the Czech Republic, a very interesting case study about the restoration of green monuments. And this was aimed at strengthening the protection of monuments against climate change, addressing long-term drought. It looks at the construction of modern reservoirs for protection with water tanks made of different types of material. And a really good example given in this case study is the Prince's Garden in Ljubljana, excuse my pronunciation there. And this looks at adapting a formal Baroque garden to climate change in accordance with the National Adaptation Plan. And what it's done is it's installed these huge stainless steel underground tanks to prevent long-term droughts. And my next slide moves on to Croatia, the art of dry stone walling. And this is very much intangible cultural heritage, but it also covers, the skills, but also these dry stone walls are an attraction in their own right. And they're found throughout Europe, including Ireland and Spain and Portugal. They combat floods and droughts, avalanches. So an important part of this case study is about the training of passing this skill on to the next generation. Next slide, just to mention France, Bordeaux, and this is another interesting case study. Bordeaux, a population of nearly 1 million people, and this case study focuses on collaborative planning, regulating town planning with an aim to conserving, enhancing the architecture, urban and heritage, landscape heritage. It places nature at the centre of the city with revegetation and tree planting, and it also involves citizens, involves the residents in the planning. The next slide is a case study which illustrates an excellent example of the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings in Slovenia. And it's Ljubljana, the Hotel Tivoli. And this involves insulation works, energy efficiency, glazing, and the end result is a wonderful art centre, a work studio, and an artist residence. And actually, it also won an award as well, the EU Architectural Award. So my next slide, just to give a very quick summary. Climate change threatens all forms of heritage. We know that. But we also know from our meetings and from this report that the data is mainly on immovable heritage. And there's a lack, even at that, of qualitative and quantitative data. The main threats to cultural heritage: severe precipitation, floods, heat waves, droughts, and sea level rise. There are 10 recommendations in the report, and they emphasise the importance of cultural heritage, but also a structural, cross-sectoral cooperation is required at all levels. Also, introduce a platform. There's a need for a platform so we can exchange information, exchange best practices. At national and regional authorities, there's a requirement there for them to invest in training, knowledge sharing, expertise, research projects, and to incentivize people to look at this whole area of cultural heritage and climate change. Because already a lot has been done at EU level. The earliest project was back in 2004 with Noah's Ark, but it's the national and regional level that really needs a boost. And then there's also a need for data on economic costs for adaptation and mitigation of climate change and cultural heritage. Something like the Stern Review needs to be carried out. So if there's one takeaway from this presentation, it's on my next slide. Safeguarding cultural heritage for future generations, because that's what we're doing and that's what it's all about. And the greenest building is the one already built. My next slide just mentions some Creative Europe open calls, which may be of interest to you, as my presentation will be circulated. And my very last slide, the next slide, please. I provided a link to the report that I spoke about, Strengthening Cultural Heritage Resilience for Climate Change. And I also want to mention there, with the links, you'll see that next year, 2003 is the European Year of Skills. And that's where I mentioned the Croatian example about intangible heritage, the practice of passing on these traditional skills to the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. We know that you are a little bit in a hurry, so that you have another meeting in 16:40, so we overpassed for 5 minutes. So many thanks to you, and good luck, and see you next time.
Please circulate the presentation and the report, because the 83 case studies are so important. There's such a wealth of information in there. So thank you, and the best of luck.
Thank you very much. We will do it. Thank you. Bye.
Slán, bye.
Tak. Děkujeme ještě jednou Annie Grady za její...
Thank you so much, Annie, for your contribution, and I have to replace Naděžda Hábová. She's got some other obligations. The presidency is not easy, so she's having another presentation in the frame of the Czech presidency. So let me now take the floor. I've already taken the floor, and let me invite Mr. Išvold to join me on stage, Mr. Krčmář, as well as Pavel Prouza. So gentlemen, join me on stage, please.
Tak máte tam uprostřed společný.
You have a microphone to share on stage. To begin with, I will ask Mr. Krčmář. Your presentation covered the new in the old, and you let the audience to make their own opinion on how to perceive the new in the old. So could you please tell us how you perceive the conversions of historical buildings for new purposes? Is this a way of saving European heritage? Can you hear me? Obviously, it's not a positive thing if it is at any cost. You have to look at heritage sites which lost their original function, and it's clear that it would not be renewed, such as the example of the city spa in Liberec, or also industrial heritage sites in Ostrava, the mining region of this country, for instance, where the technologies are simply not there, but we keep the architecture, we keep the buildings. So this is some potential. And also there is a second issue. What is the willingness of the government to finance the protection of heritage sites which are no longer used for their original purposes, but sites that can be used to contemporaries or future generations? It's similar for the stock administered by the National Heritage Institute, so primarily castles and chateaus. I discussed it with one of the colleagues today, For modernist architecture, for instance, the state should identify a segment of buildings that either are owned by the state or the state would be willing to purchase them, and think of some use and purpose for them and operate them. Mr. Proza, do you want to respond? New in old buildings, new practical uses of old buildings? That's a necessity. I do not understand your question, really. It's necessary to look for new uses for old buildings. You can't do without it. That is our key topic and main task. Very few times, if you have a historical building that you protect, is used for the original purposes. It's quite unique. For instance, for our project at Lobec, the brewery project, if we started with a similar project 5 or 10 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked because it wouldn't be the right period for it. And we delivered the project in the right period. If you have such buildings, you have to look for new uses. It needn't be today. Today, you have to make sure that the buildings are kept, conserved, and wait for the society to be, for instance, financially strong enough to provide them with new purposes. What about Slovakia? This is also a topic in Slovakia. Obviously, I can quote a couple of examples. For instance, the Trenčianske Teplice case. Where are the limits? Where can we go? What are the limits of the new functions? And when are we supposed to maintain the original state or find purposes that would not contradict the original purposes? If you look at the large heritage sites, there it is even more difficult. The associated cost is immense. Also, you have the dichotomy between private ownership and public interest. The operational cost is often very high. And going back to Istropolis demolition, one thing is the academic level, and the other thing is the funding, the financial considerations. I didn't get acquainted with this topic because I have been director since the 1st of May only. And since then, we are trying to press on at least listing works of art from this ensemble. And currently we are inscribing and registering them as a cultural heritage. Can the state be responsible for economic losses? You don't have budget for it. And today it has been discussed already. You can talk to the local administrations. And as the previous speaker has said, you may identify some buildings where the state would take over the burden, and then you can save the authentic substance of these sites. My next question concerns the current trend of architects in renovating cultural heritage. Often they used contrast materials. We saw that in the presentation of Mr. Krčmar, who showed the example of the Helfstein Castle or the Neratov Church. So there is a contrast between old materials and modern materials. Is this trend of dividing the historical essence and the modernist elements as correct? I think I mentioned this in my talk. It's based on the principles that have been developing for some 100 years now. If you do not conserve or perform regular maintenance of the site, you need to differentiate between the old and the new. And ideally, it takes this form. You have to always be careful with the amounts so that the modern elements do not prevail over the historical aspect or countenance. It's a challenge for architects, truly, and it's good if the renovation of heritage sites is done by an architect who has some experience in heritage site renovations, because designing a project for a heritage site is not the same thing as any other building, where the architect, the investor, may dare do more. Heritage sites only withstand a sensitive approach. I agree. The principle of making a difference between the old and the new is correct. You couldn't do it in any other way. Now, it's always about the specific solution. It's very individual, we all know that. And if I was to comment it as an architect, we know that there is an infinite number of solutions and approaches to the same issue, but very few of them are correct. So it's about selecting a good solution, an appropriate one. Also, the degree of differentiation is important. It can be a contrast or a more neutral contextual solutions that we might not notice at first sight, only when we focus on the details. I was talking about castles today. In Slovakia, there has been some debate involving the public, and the public looks at the entire art expression, and some of the architectural designs for the castles, the architects went for quite some contrast. The debate is still open, and it's not resolved yet. So we are wondering where it will go. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? If there are no further questions, allow me to finish this two-day event, our international conference focusing on the challenges of contemporary European heritage care. Thank you all for your attention. It was great to share this time together. It's great that we were able to deliver the presence and online lectures. You could see it yesterday that it can be quite difficult. We managed to do so. Czech presidency 2022 is running, and next year, starting in January, Sweden is taking over. We have representatives of the Swedish Ministry of Culture here with us, and in a symbolic manner, I would like to hand the relay to them and wish them all the luck with their presidency. Thank you once again.